Good afternoon. It's Labour Day here in New Zealand. It's Monday. We should be slaving away, but we're not. Nick and Brian. I've just had a look at Brian's previous clip, which he extolled the virtues of the dreadful economic and environmental environment we're living in. So, as a big post-oil person, I jumped on the cycle and biked round to Brian's to make this video, and
you did?
As you know, I'm looking pretty sick now because Brian lives at the top of a hell of a big hill.
Yeah.
And I haven't been on a bike for a while, so it was really quite good.
And not only that, but I have to say I was just talking to my partner about one of your virtues, and that is you are reluctant to throw things out. So therefore this bike has been resuscitated, reconstructed, and he's still using it rather than just going and buying another consumable.
Yeah, it's really quite an interesting one because we got a horrible habit in the Western world, you know, where while we're ostensibly poorer than we've been for a long time, we still find it very possible to go down and get the cheapest bauble in the form of a bicycle rather than repair the one you already have. And what you've got with all the embedded energy is sitting there rusting, and you just throw it out and you get a new one. A little bit of elbow grease, well, the old one's as good as new. It's probably a little bit of a salutary lesson in terms of where we're going as a society and what we're going to actually have to get used to doing. Because we don't have to live a bad life, but the one thing we do need to do is get rid of some of our very bad habits.
Yes. Indeed, we do have lots of bad habits, don't we? You don't want to be too pious about it. I remember the Minister of Science in an interview at Indian television. She was complaining about how the West had done its share of polluting, and now India wanted a turn. And it's sort of hypocrisy that all of these developing countries, you know, the Vietnamese, they want to get off bicycles and onto motorcycles, and then from motorcycles to cars, I guess. So everything that we've done.
Yeah, and I mean, why shouldn't they in one sense? But yeah. Look, I'm going to change the subject slightly because Brian was talking about the economics of the Western world, and he was talking about bonuses to the executive. There are a couple of interesting things. If you're living in New Zealand, you probably saw it on the news. If you're living offshore, we have this ingrained habit where we've got this thing here in New Zealand and right across the Western world that the moment someone's unemployed and on the benefit, we tend to kick them. And we complain about people on benefits ripping us off, us the taxpayer. Very interestingly, there was a figure quoted on the news with some reputable research that tax evaders were costing us somewhere in the region of about 28 times what benefit fraudsters were. The interesting thing was the benefit fraudsters were getting sentences 3 times as long, which brings me to the point of what I'm saying. I'm using that as a bit of an example, but the thing which worries me in terms of our societies as we go through this recession is that we're losing our cogency because we don't actually uphold the law, or we don't uphold the justice system. We have a law system which is unjust to some people and very, very loose in terms of its ability to prosecute or its unwillingness to prosecute and the political corruption behind it. The people who are actually taking our money. For example, if you look at what's going on Wall Street, all they have to do is adhere to the laws and actually do some prosecutions, and they can fix it straight away, but that's not going to happen. And the real issue is that the moment you institutionalize the unfairness, the moment you, like Max Kaiser talks about in the market sense, talks about how you completely detached the market from the pricing mechanism, i.e. the ability for the market to find a price as opposed to it being rigged up like it was in the LIBOR scandal, and for the banksters to walk away with all the money. What you've really done is you've said to the people and to the people who actually have to use currency that you no longer have control. And really where we're going as a society is into a scenario where those who are making the rules, it's the old golden rule, are basically deciding for us. So democracy is ceasing to work. At the same time, I think Brian and I would probably like to talk about those people who are finding that, you know, that the comfort levels are disappearing, and they may be out of work, they may be trying to find work. The youngsters in this country, I call them youngsters, I was one once, sub-25-year-olds, over half of them not working. Of that half, probably half of them in study, racking up huge amounts of debt. That to me is a wasted generation, and you know, it's not cogent, and as Brian says, it will come to grief.
Yeah, well, I just think of every decade where, you know, there's a group of people who get wasted. And I don't talk about starting from, say, the First World War. There's a whole heap of people got wasted in the First World War. In the 1880 depression, which impacted, excuse me, very severely on New Zealand, and a lot of people don't understand it, but I had a great grandfather who lived through it, and he talked to my grandfather one day when I was very young about those two depressions, the 1880 and the 1930, which went on for some time. But, you know, the Second World War, 6 years, a wasted generation. The Great Depression, a wasted generation. And it just seems to be, we don't want to romanticise what goes on in the history of the world, but this massive problem of sharing the resources, and it's all really about that. We're now at a time where those resources need to be shared again in an equitable manner, and there's going to be less to go around. So instead of actually confronting this head on, what do? We continue with the old paradigm. It's utterly shot.
I think what you'll find though is that people will start to develop their own way of life outside of the system, and then it'll get a critical mass. The system will lose its legitimacy unless it actually caters for the majority. At the moment the majority are being fed, but the minority are increasing hugely at a very rapid rate. And the really interesting thing is, if I go around all the people I know and ask what their children are doing, what I'm finding is, they haven't got work, they've gone for training at something, or they're sitting around. And these are people who are ostensibly what we describe as middle class. I describe this massive explosion of middle class in the Western society over the last 50 years. It's really being high-grade working class, and we're soon going to realise how proletarian we really all are. Coming back to my point, it's for people who actually make practical alternatives for themselves, won't be at all shocked by this, and they probably won't be at all worried about the way the system is working the way it is, simply because they've dissociated, they've voted with their feet. The thing is, the system can't operate if those people increase in too large numbers, so I do foresee grief coming up.
Yeah, well, of course, you see, in the transition periods, it's never smooth.
No.
And so, unfortunately, and I mean, you and I don't want to be casualties in it, but it's very hard. I mean, the one thing that I remember in my conversations with my great-grandfather was that people had huge problems keeping what they had. And I mean, so this is a talk around the town at the moment, as everyone's saying, you know, it's not a question of investing so you can get something, it's a question of investing so you can hang on to what you've got.
Yeah.
And of course, that's a pretty vexing issue, and once you get into that, there's no end of difficulties.
Yeah.
So, look,
I'd just sort of like to finish on a sort of point here with Brian. I talked about dissociating yourself from the system, and no one can, you know, obviously the old thing about no man is an island comes into place. But I'd like to talk about a couple of things which are very pertinent to the way I've lived, and I think it comes down to, it's an age-old story and involves, we can probably use a couple of examples, St. Francis and St. Dominic. And Francis led by example. He didn't ask people to do what he did. He just set the example and he moved ahead. Dominic, by comparison, went and told the people what they should think. And he preached to them and cajoled them from the top. And this is the scenario we're constantly facing. I mean, they weren't the first people to come up with that sort of different paradigm, different way of thinking. But they're good examples of what's going on now. The media is telling us what to think. We're being told what to do. We're being preached at by those who have, by the power. The people who we need to really watch are the people who are standing on the side and are doing things which are practical. And next couple of times around when Brian and I talk, I think we'll actually talk about some practical examples we've come across and some things which, you know, you, the viewer, can do to actually make sure that you've got a foot in any camp you want to have, because you know what to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now listen, before we close this one off, Nick, there is a man who's been doing this, and he lives in Chicago, I think. Anyway, they made a documentary about this lovely fellow. It's called In Search of Sugar Man, and this is about the singer Rodriguez, who is the most incredible person. I mean, he actually, in one of the interviews, he actually went out of his way to say he had deliberately lived below his means. Think of that. This somebody who, and I mean, the whole story, I highly recommend it. You've got to go and see it, guys, In Search of Sugar Man. Because, you know, if ever I saw a person leading by example, you know, he does it without fuss, he's low key, he has a wonderful understanding of what's going on, a beautiful singing voice, still at 70, he's singing wonderfully, plays the guitar with real skill, and has wonderful insight. And if you haven't heard about him, I tell you, just go Google Rodriguez and